president has made it quite clear that if narco-terrorists, again, are trafficking illegal drugs towards the United States, he has the authority to kill them. And that's what this administration is doing.
10:48 p.m., El Paso, Texas. Cartel execution on U.S. soil. 3 men dead, 2 officers killed. 1 high-value target eliminated, a network inside U.S. neighborhoods. This is the first strike of a cartel threat now moving inside the United States, closer to Americans than anyone realizes. Let me show you.
Fentanyl precursors are what makes up fentanyl. While we, the interagency, the Department of Justice, have been fighting hard to seize and stop drug traffickers, we must attack fentanyl precursors, the ingredients necessary to make this lethal drug.
10:48 p.m., El Paso, Texas. A quiet neighborhood was shattered by rapid gunfire as an unmarked SUV rolled up and unleashed a burst of bullets across a convenience store parking lot. When the smoke cleared, 3 men were down, 2 off-duty officers and the man they were protecting. Investigators knew instantly this wasn't a robbery or random attack. The scene was too clean, the timing too tight, the escape almost surgical. This was a cartel execution on American soil. The real target was Nico Delta Cruz. For years, he had funneled people, drugs, and money through secret routes across New Mexico and Texas. He even operated a reinforced underground tunnel wired with electricity and ventilation, evidence of a far deeper network. But once that tunnel was exposed, Cruz became a liability. And cartels eliminate liabilities with bullets. What happened in El Paso wasn't a lone incident. It was the opening strike of a threat already pushing deep into the United States. Hit like so this story reaches more Americans before it's too late. In the days after the El Paso execution, federal agents widened their search, not for the shooters, but for the structure that made the attack possible. Very quickly, a clearer and far more disturbing picture emerged. This wasn't the work of a small crew. It was the footprint of a network operating quietly inside the United States. For years, Nico Delta Cruz had been more than a smuggler. He was the conduit between cartel bosses in Mexico and a hidden pipeline stretching from New Mexico into Texas, quietly moving people, drugs, and money deeper into the country. But once the smuggling tunnel he oversaw was exposed earlier this year, Cruz became a threat to his own organization. A man who knew too much, saw too much, and might talk if cornered. That's when investigators began hearing one name whispered with fear: La Empressa. La Empressa is not a typical cartel. It doesn't fire wildly or leave messy crime scenes. It moves like a trained insurgent force. Quiet, disciplined, almost invisible. Migrants are their currency. Silence is their protection. Precision is their signature. In the last 18 months alone, agents documented 27 targeted executions tied to the group. Clean shots, controlled bursts, each victim tied to smuggling routes or financial disputes. In several cases, shooters disabled cameras before the attack, showing military-level planning. Drug seizures painted the same picture. 612 pounds of meth, 41 pounds of high-purity fentanyl, 9 modified transport vehicles, 2 mobile stash vans for rapid hostage movement. When FBI and IC teams followed Cruz's trail into Sunland Park and Las Cruces, the truth hit hard. Hidden in ordinary neighborhoods were not run-down stash houses, but organized detention sites. Inside, over 50 migrants stood packed shoulder to shoulder, some terrified, some confused, many unsure which country they were even in. Some believed they were still in Mexico. Others thought they were moments from release. None realized they were being stored like inventory. Every door forced open led to the same conclusion. La Empressa isn't moving north. It is already here, quietly rooted in suburbs, operating behind closed curtains, building routes, and stockpiling weapons. And after the El Paso massacre, one fact became unmistakably clear. La Empressa's expansion didn't begin last week. It has been underway for years. Don't look away. What comes next proves La Empressa is far deeper inside the U.S. than anyone realized. Share this to warn others. By the end of the week, federal agents were done watching. The killing in El Paso, the stash houses in Sunland Park, the migrants hidden in Las Cruces. None of it looked isolated anymore. It looked coordinated, and Washington knew exactly what that meant. La Empressa was positioning itself to carve out territory inside the United States. At sunrise on a Thursday morning, the response began. FBI, ICE, DHS, and state troopers formed a joint task force stretching across New Mexico and Texas. Command centers lit up with satellite maps, drone feeds, and surveillance data gathered over months. Agents weren't preparing for arrests. They were preparing for a fight. The first hit came in Las Cruces. Agents had been tracking a gray SUV that appeared in multiple smuggling investigations. When the vehicle rolled into a residential area, surveillance teams moved in quietly. 3 men stepped out, each carrying a long rifle. They didn't hide. They moved like men who believed they controlled the neighborhood. When unmarked vehicles boxed them in, the suspects didn't surrender. They ran. What followed was a chase straight through suburban streets, cars fishtailing around corners, residents peeking through windows as sirens exploded around them. The SUV they were chasing smashed through a fence and slid into a backyard. The suspects bolted toward a small stucco house, firing a warning shot as they kicked the door open. Agents returned fire. The battle lasted less than 2 minutes, but every second felt like a war zone. Inside, officers found not just the gunmen, but an entire weapons depot. Rifles stacked against walls, boxes of ammunition, tactical vests, communication gear. And in the back bedroom, 3 migrants hunched together, terrified, waiting for ransom calls that might have never come. But Las Cruces was only the beginning. Within hours, teams stormed safe houses in Sunland Park, El Paso's outskirts, and pockets of rural Texas. Some locations surrendered without a fight. Others turned violent instantly. At one home near Anthony, Texas, agents breached the front door only to be met with gunfire from the hallway. Another team raiding an abandoned trailer outside Deming found pressure plates and tripwire. Proof that La Empressa had begun using military-style traps. By nightfall, more than a dozen cartel members were in custody, and several migrants were rescued. 40-plus firearms were seized, along with encrypted phones and cash bundles wrapped in electrical tape. On paper, it was a success, but everyone inside the command center felt the same uneasy truth. La Empressa hadn't been caught off guard. It had only been slowed down. And a cartel that loses ground never retreats quietly. If you're still here, comment yes. The retaliation you're about to hear is far more violent. The raids across New Mexico and Texas should have slowed the violence, but instead, they did the opposite. As federal teams gathered evidence and processed suspects, a new wave of retaliation began to roll across the Southwest, faster and more violent than anything investigators had expected. It became clear that La Empressa had no intention of losing ground. They would answer force with force. The first warning came out of Laredo, Texas. Just after midnight, a federal patrol spotted a white pickup riding low on its rear axle, often a sign of human cargo or drugs. When agents attempted to stop, the truck accelerated. Moments later, it swerved sharply and rammed straight into the patrol vehicle. The impact flipped both cars. Agents crawled from the wreckage. 6 people were found dead inside the pickup. 3 believed to be smugglers. 3 migrants who never had a chance to escape. To investigators, it didn't look like a desperate attempt to flee. It looked like a deliberate attack, the kind cartels use to send a message. Hours later, Arizona saw something even more alarming. A convoy of state troopers traveling along a remote highway near the Pima County line reported seeing headlights approach from behind at high speed. Before they could react, automatic gunfire erupted from a black SUV. Bullets tore across the asphalt. One patrol unit spun out and slammed into a ditch. Another vehicle, trailing the convoy, was stopped on the shoulder. The attackers aimed for it deliberately. Seconds later, the SUV burst into flames. Dash cam footage later showed the last patrol unit engulfed in fire, its lights flashing weakly until the batteries melted. Troopers described the attack as military style, with shooters firing in trained bursts, withdrawing before backup could arrive. There were no arrests, no suspects. Only shell casings and tire marks cut into the sand. But the violence wasn't contained to border roads. In California's Central Valley, the danger crept into neighborhoods where people rarely thought about cartel violence. Bakersfield officers were investigating a series of suspicious stash houses when the unthinkable happened. A veteran officer was ambushed while driving his personal vehicle home. Witnesses heard short, controlled bursts. Again, the hallmark of trained shooters. His car drifted to a stop against the curb, lights still on. By the time help arrived, he was gone. This was no longer a series of random confrontations. It was a pattern, a coordinated spread of violence crossing state lines, hitting law enforcement with precision. La Empressa, once a shadow organization creeping north from Mexico, was acting like an army testing the strength of government response. Across New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and California, local police departments began issuing internal warnings. Patrol officers were told to avoid traveling alone, even off-duty. Rural counties requested additional body armor, long rifles, and helicopter support. Some agencies started escorting officers home after shifts, a measure not seen since major cartel wars in northern Mexico more than a decade earlier. The Southwest wasn't slipping into crisis. It was already there. And while federal agents tried to regroup after the multi-state raids, one truth was becoming harder to ignore. La Empressa wasn't just fighting back. It was expanding. Tap like right now. It helps push this story into the feeds of people who have no idea how close this danger already is. As violence spread across the Southwest, another crisis was unfolding, one that rarely made headlines but carried consequences just as deadly. Along the migrant routes stretching from El Paso to Tucson and across the desert corridors of Southern California, people searching for safety were walking straight into the grip of La Empressa. For decades, the journey north had always been dangerous. But now, migrants weren't just facing harsh terrain or exhaustion. They were stepping into a landscape controlled almost entirely by criminal groups that saw human beings not as travelers, but as revenue, leverage, and sometimes disposable property. In Sunland Park, agents who raided a stash house earlier in the week reported something troubling. Many of the migrants found there, men, women, and several teenagers, had been moved through multiple states before ending up in that dark, crowded room. Some thought they were still in Mexico. Others believed they were moments from freedom. Instead, they were waiting for cartel phone calls demanding thousands of dollars from their families. But the stories didn't end there. In rural pockets of southern Arizona, ranchers found makeshift camps littered with torn clothing, food containers, and identification documents left behind by people fleeing cartel scouts. These scouts, often armed, watched the desert like sentries. Migrants who tried to avoid cartel-controlled crossing points were intercepted anyway, sometimes beaten, sometimes taken, other times simply vanishing into the night. One Border Patrol report described finding a young woman alone in a dry riverbed. She had been separated from her group when armed men arrived and selected several migrants to take with them. She didn't know where they were taken. She only remembered hearing crying as they were pushed into a truck. Federal agents later discovered that La Empressa had begun using migrants for more than smuggling fees. Some were forced to transport small packages. Others were photographed and threatened, their images sent back to families to demand payments. A few were offered a choice: work for the cartel or disappear, and too many disappeared. Even law enforcement could feel the shift. Search teams recovered scattered belongings miles from established routes. Shoes, backpacks, baby blankets, silent markers of people who had set out toward a better life but never reached the next step. Medical examiners in several counties reported an increase in unidentified remains, a sign that desperation was pushing migrants into more remote, more lethal terrain. Across communities, churches and shelters were overwhelmed. Volunteers who once offered water and blankets were now reporting encounters with frightened migrants warning, "Don't go that way. Men with guns are waiting." The truth was becoming unavoidable. The migrant trail was no longer just a journey. It had become a hunting ground. And as the raids intensified and cartel violence spread, the danger for migrants didn't shrink. It grew. Because cartels under pressure don't retreat, they tighten their grip on the most vulnerable people they can reach. La Empressa was proving exactly that. By the time federal agents finished their reports, one reality was impossible to ignore. The violence was no longer contained to border towns. It had spread into suburbs, highways, farms, and cities across the Southwest. Officers were being ambushed. Migrants were being hunted. Families were living in fear. And La Empressa was not slowing down. Washington could no longer treat this as a regional problem. Inside the White House Situation Room, officials reviewed footage from the multi-state raids, satellite images of desert movements, and intercepted calls linking stash houses from New Mexico all the way to Central California. The conclusion came quickly and quietly. This was not traditional crime anymore. This was organized infiltration. A foreign-backed criminal group had built a network inside the United States.